Some words are simply vague, weak, or completely unnecessary, and we need to take a look at if they really belong in our writing. By having a quick list of words to search for, I hope that this will make your editing go a little faster and a little smoother. For each suggestion of change considerations, I'm going to offer you an example, as well as a little discussion about why I think this change is almost always the right way to go. Because part of this is understanding why these words are sometimes weak, vague, or simply unnecessary. Your ability to critically think and make an informed decision, because sometimes you can leave them in. Welcome to CTRL+F is your editing friend, part 2. Hi, hello, welcome in. I'm Jerica, and I'm an editor, writer, and all-around content creator, and today we're going to discuss some of the more easily searchable terms and phrases that you may want to ditch to make your writing stronger and more engaging. Last time we talked about showing versus telling, and some of the words and phrases that are kind of signposts to this in your writing. Today's topic is a little more abstract, with words that are vague, weak, or simply add nothing to your writing. Of course, there are always considerations to voice, tone, pacing, and rhythm before you just dash all of these from your writing, but checking and making these informed decisions will help you understand when it's right to leave them in. Let's get into it. The first category is name it, or looking for thing, stuff, and it. If you can find a word to replace it, you should probably do it. The more information we give the reader, the better, even if we're being coy about the object's true identity. We don't have to come out and tell the reader or the characters what the item is, but there are usually words that can give a little more oomph than just thing or stuff. And the word it becomes a problem more when it's unclear what object we're referring to. This is more of a pronoun issue. So sometimes it's certainly better to name it. And therefore there is the obvious exception where we don't want to repeat the item's name over and over again, where using it makes a lot of sense. So let's discuss some examples. Example 1. The thing was covered in black sticky stuff. Versus, the shelf was covered in black sticky goo. Or, the shelf oozed with black sludge. Of course, we're looking at this sentence in a vacuum, so it is possible that thing was obvious with the context around it, but I'd argue it's still generally better to name it, or use it instead, even though that's one of the words we're looking for. With that out of the way, let's look at the star of the show, the black sticky stuff. Stuff adds nothing extra to the black stickiness, while a word like goo or sludge does, while still not outright telling us what this substance is. An easy way to kind of examine this is to look at those nouns kind of on their own and what they influence you to see, even if you don't know that the substance is black and sticky. For instance, when I think of goo, I generally think of something sticky already. It's definitely some sort of thick liquid rather than a thin one. It's one that can sit on a vertical surface almost as well as it can sit on a horizontal one. And I generally think of it as just a liquid. I kind of also have this idea that it's not opaque. On the other hand, when I think of sludge, I think of something even thicker and kind of holding its shape a little bit better. I kind of think of it as moving as well, although it certainly doesn't have to. It also has the opportunity to have inclusions in it, like bits of stuff, for some reason in my mind. And I also think of it as being an opaque liquid rather than a transparent or translucent one like goo. But then, on our third hand, the one that shouldn't exist, is stuff. And that just brings no sort of image to my mind. Stuff could be anything. And there are times where that kind of makes sense, when maybe you can't tell what is in the array of items you have. Perhaps you're talking about an attic. Maybe stuff is okay when it's just a bunch of random stuff. There's arguments still to be made that stuff is incorrect without looking at context. I apologize for the growling that you might be hearing. Also, I feel like my hair is falling out here. What am I gonna do? I'm a mess! Yeah, Iggy, I'm a mess! There is a second fix that I want to point out here, and that is the changing or adding of a verb. Dude. Now, again, because we're looking at this sentence all on its own and we don't actually know what the stuff is, it may not make sense to use the word ooze, because ooze implies movement of this sticky black liquid. But it is something that can add a lot to a sentence by creating movement and action rather than it just sitting there, if it happens to be moving. The other thing to kind of take note with using a verb is that sometimes it can get rid of adjectives and adverbs, which we don't need to get rid of all of them. It would be very silly to get rid of all of them, but they are a word type that we should be aware of, and make sure that they are adding to the sentence. So at some points, if you can use a verb in a stronger verb or a stronger noun instead of the adjective, that's great. So if ooze makes sense, we may not need to talk about its stickiness. That might already tell us. The same thing with goo. That might already tell us that it's sticky. That doesn't mean that we don't use sticky, that has to go away too. It's just, again, something else to consider. Let's look at another example. Example 2. Red stuff pooled from beneath the door versus a red puddle had formed beneath the door. Or red seeped from beneath the door. Now, you might be thinking that liquid is a good option here. And it's not wrong, it's better than stuff, but it doesn't carry as much weight. Especially since the act of it pooling kind of brings to mind a liquid. There's not much else that can pool. Now, if we want to get into the science of everything, air can pool, any fluid can pool, but in general, something pooling is going to be considered a liquid. So if it isn't a liquid, that's the time to say the gas pooled, or something like that. My personal favorite fix here is to make red the subject. Red suddenly goes from adjective to noun. Overall, I think a consideration that has yet to be mentioned is the idea of the thesaurus problem. And I do think that I'm going to do some sort of video on that at some point. But to me, the thesaurus problem is using a thesaurus without a dictionary, basically. So you go to a thesaurus, you find a word that it says is a synonym, and you plug it in. But while the definition may work, the connotation doesn't necessarily. Just be mindful that when you're making these changes, you're actually making your writing stronger, and you're not falling into the pitfall of big word look smarter. The key is to use a word that kind of takes in some of the information from the adjectives and adverbs around it. Speaking of adjectives and adverbs, let's move on to our next category, which is adverbs, or searching for ly. Adverbs are part of language. Yes. They're important. Yes. But they're not always used effectively. The biggest problem is when an adverb doesn't actually add any information to the sentence. And the second is simply that there's a stronger verb that means the same thing as the adverb-verb pair. As writers, we're constantly looking to optimize our words to get the most bang for our buck. Long, complicated prose isn't bad, but we really want each word to count. Forget the techniques you used to fluff up your word count in school to meet the word count you needed. We're looking for efficient writing, keeping in mind, of course, voice, tone, pacing, rhythm. Example 1. The boxes loudly fell to the ground. Versus, the boxes crashed to the floor. Or, as the boxes fell, they clanged against every surface. The sound of jostling inside had everyone holding their breath. The main issue here is loudly fell has so many synonyms in a single word. And I'd argue each of these words has even more information. Synonyms include crashed, clanged, banged, thumped, exploded, thudded, clamored. But let's look at how each one of these adds even more information than simply loudly fell. Clang evokes glass or metal sounds, while a thud is more dense and subdued. This indicates different things about what is inside that box that's falling. Let's look at another example. This one using an adverb-verb pair that is common and bad. Consider, over here, the voice whispered quietly, versus, over here, the voice whispered, or, over here, the voice rasped. Or, if you really need an adverb, over here, the voice whispered melodically. Whispers are already quiet! Now, sure, you could, there's louder whispers than others, but it just doesn't add any quality to the whisper the way that changing it to rasped does. That definitely lowers the volume to me, but it also changes the quality of the whisper and is just not a whisper anymore at all. But let's look at what a useful adverb might look like in this case. I added melodically to it, because not all whispers are melodic. That adds a new quality to the whisper. It speaks to the cadence of the whisper. Or that maybe there's an extra quality to it. Like maybe we're talking about fairies and there's fairies or elves or something like that that have a different quality to their voice. And so this is signifying that this whisper isn't coming from a human, but some other sort of being. And of course, now is a great time to discuss dialogue tags. This is our next category. The category is called Too Many Dialogue Tags. And the things you're looking for are, of course, said, yelled, whispered, shouted, anything that you might use to describe how somebody is speaking. You should know the ones that you use the most, and that will help you figure out your list of things to search. Let's talk about them. Dialogue tags themselves are not a problem. The problem comes when we use too many of them and or when we vary away from said. This is a really strange one for a lot of people because we were told over and over and over again that said is dead. And maybe at one time that was the convention, but a lot of the advice now is to avoid dialogue tags when you can, and when you do have to use them, to keep them to said about 90% of the time. There are times to use other ones, and we'll get to that. This problem is hard to diagnose in a vacuum, but I still have some examples and some things to discuss about them. So let's look at our first one. Example 1. I'm going to the store. Do you need anything? Jesse hollered. We need milk, Chip answered. Versus, I'm going to the store. Do you need anything? Jesse hollered. We need milk. The fix is to simply remove dialogue tags, or at least some of them. Again, we're looking for when dialogue tags add something rather than just being there. So there are two things that I want to kind of draw your attention to. The first is that we're assuming there's context outside of this dialogue that explains that the person Jesse is hollering to is Chip. And the second thing is notice which dialogue tag I removed, and I want you to take a second to think about why that's the one I removed. Did you say that it's because it's clear that the second line of dialogue is answering the question of the first one? You're right, but there's actually a secondary reason. Not only did I remove Chip answering because it's clear that he's answering, but I also chose to leave hollered because that adds a quality both to what Jesse is saying and maybe even speaks to where they are while it's being said. Because the second that Jesse hollers it, it makes me think of trying to get your voice across a long distance. So maybe Jesse is standing in the doorway yelling back into the house. Maybe they are standing at the back door yelling out to Chip in the fields or the backyard. It gives a new quality to not just the dialogue, but the setting too. And because I chose to leave a dialogue tag that isn't said, like I said, should be about 90% of your dialogue tags, let's talk about why you might use something else and kind of the other parameters here. By using said as most of your dialogue tags, it kind of makes it invisible. Readers don't really pay attention to the fact that said is being said. It's really only there to kind of remind them and keep them on track with who's speaking in long dialogue or when dialogue first begins. For the other 10%, the general rule of thumb is to have 3 to 5 other dialogue tag types that you use. Generally, you want something for when somebody speaks loudly, so you want to choose between like shouted or yelled or hollered. You want something for when somebody speaks quietly, so something like a whisper. You can certainly then use like asked and answered, because those are qualities. Those I would use few and far between because we have the opportunity to use a question mark. And then maybe like 1%, 0.5% should be the ones that are spicing it up that you use like once or twice in your entire manuscript, where you throw in a chimed or a sang or something that you're not going to be using very often that really just adds to the quality of the dialogue or characterizes the person speaking. Basically, those kind of like extra ones are times where you want to really draw the reader's attention to the way that it's being spoken. There is a second option to avoid these dialogue tags, so let's look at a second example. Example 2. I might love her, Michael said. Well, what are you going to do about it? Max coaxed. I don't know, Michael replied. Versus, I might love her, Michael said. Well, what are you going to do about it? I don't know. Michael rested his head in his hands. The fix here is action tags. They add some atmosphere, they add a little action, they give more of a picture than just he said, she said, he said, she said. It also comes off a lot more realistic. We don't sit like this while we talk. Well, I mean, maybe some people do, and maybe sometimes we do, but in general, when we're in conversation, there's something else going on. It may be something else kind of grander, like, you know, husband and wife are having an argument while one of them does the dishes. So mentioning like slamming the dish into the drying rack or something might add some extra emotionality to the scene. Additionally, most of us don't sit here straight-faced, so describing facial expressions while people are speaking can add to uh, the subtext of what's being said. Also, if you haven't noticed, some of us speak with our hands. And so describing, you know, a very energetic speaker throwing their hands in the air can really help characterize that character. Characterize that character? That's a bad sentence. And that's why we write and we edit instead of us speaking. Basically, choosing to add some action tags in amongst your dialogue tags and tagless dialogue just adds a dimension. You can, again, add emotionality, you can add subtext, you can add characterization. It just is giving more information. That seems to be a bit of a theme. Alright, let's move on to our next category. The conjunction that doesn't matter, or that. This one is a little bit confusing because it's not every instance of that is a problem. It's obviously a word that we need. Otherwise, I wouldn't have said it, what, 4 times just now? However, when it's used as a conjunction, it often doesn't need to be there, and removing it doesn't change the meaning of the sentence. It's fine as a determiner or a relative or demonstrative pronoun, though we may start getting into the name it problem from our first category. I have put an article in the description that kind of goes over what the different parts of speech that encompasses that might help you understand this a little bit further, but hopefully looking at the following examples will help you in practice. Example 1. Can you believe that she kissed him? Versus, can you believe she kissed him? There really is no change here in the meaning of the sentence. It's such a silly word. This really comes down to style in most cases and the way that you'd like the sentence to read as far as rhythm and flow and voiciness, but I would make the suggestion to strike it more often than not. Unless we're talking about dialogue, in which case I have the exact opposite suggestion. Dialogue and the way that we speak, we use that a lot, and I'm sure most of the time we don't actually need it, but because it is so ingrained in our speech pattern, it might feel weird to not use it in dialogue. That being said, a very voicey piece, probably one that's in first person, it might add to that voice to continue using that. Let's look at a second example. Example 2. I don't think that many people enjoyed Domino's performance. Or, I don't think many people enjoyed Domino's performance. This is one to be careful with. The meaning does possibly change when you remove that, depending on what it's doing in that first sentence. You have to kind of look at it in context. So in this case, you have to ask yourself, is this sentence saying, I don't think as many people as you're suggesting liked it did, or I think few people enjoyed it? In a vacuum, it's really hard to say what the right call is. You have to look at everything around it. In some circumstances, it may not matter. But it's important to be paying attention that we are increasing clarity when we're making all of these changes. And that while we're increasing clarity, that meaning isn't changing. We need to be clear, concise, but maybe most importantly, correct. And here comes our final category for part 2. Don't worry, there's a part 3 coming. Order of operations, or then, next, after. We're not writing a how-to. Context tells us the order of operations more often than not. Broken record, not every instance is bad. Sometimes we do need some sort of time-based word to add clarity. Then is probably the biggest culprit in this category of words. There is usually an easy fix, turning things into lists and/or using and. We can imply causality without the basic this happened, then this happened, next this happened, after this happened kind of stream of consciousness thought. Let's look at an example. Example 1. While running for the bus, I tripped and fell, then watched the bus leave the station. Versus, while running for the bus, I tripped, fell, and watched the bus drive off. Or, my race to the bus stop ended when I tripped and fell. I sat defeated as I watched the bus pull away from the station. Now, I don't think our original sentence is the worst option, but it's an example to look at. Both of these fixes change the pace in opposite directions, so paying attention to that will be important. Perhaps that extra word really does add the right length and rhythm that you need. I think it's more interesting to look at the second fix, so let's do that. This fix adds some extra emotion to the scene. Rather than a simple order of operations, we get a little bit of interiority, we get a little bit of the feeling of how this character is reacting to what's happening, rather than just the things happening. We could jazz this up even further and show this defeatedness rather than tell it, but it's not always necessary. However, adding this emotionality also slows the pace, which in turn adds to the emotionality. So if you wanted to drag it out even further, describing and showing that feeling of defeat, the feeling of missing the bus. Not only missing the bus, but maybe embarrassing yourself as you've fallen. That can all really add to this, and is way stronger, way better, way more engaging than the simple order of operations. However, if this isn't that important of a scene, maybe a simple order of operations is exactly what you need to just explain what's happened and get into the juicy part. Example 2. First, Jenny entered the restaurant and sat beside Barb. Then came Ron, who sauntered to the other side of the table to avoid the two women. Next, Helen entered. Versus, guests slowly entered the restaurant and found their seats. Jenny sat beside Barb. Ron found his way to the far end of the table. And Helen, confused by the distance, sat in the middle. Like I said before, this kind of this happened, then this happened, next this happened, it sounds very amateur or childish, and I don't want you to take that to heart too hard. The first time you write anything, you're gonna have some bad sentences. It just happens. And the important part is that this is perfectly fine grammar-wise. You didn't make any mistakes. You can just really spruce this up. Distancing ourselves from these early teachings of how to write is how we find our own voice in writing. It's how we show we've practiced and experienced new things and more complex ideas. These particular changes, I also want to point out, really switch up the construction of the sentences. One of the biggest problems with this order of operations is that it's the same type of sentence over and over and over again. Whereas it's usually better, there are reasons to keep things the same, but it's usually better to have some long sentences, some short sentences, some compound sentences, some complex sentences. It's good for variety for the reader. And you can learn to use these repetitively to create certain vibes. It's something that you have to play around with. But having these different constructions makes it more dynamic and will kind of like help the reader engage a little bit. When something becomes monotonous, it becomes harder to engage with. It's the same thing with repeating said over and over and over again. It becomes invisible, and we certainly don't want whole sentences to start becoming invisible. And we've come to the end. The big takeaway is if it can be cut, it should be cut. That means if it doesn't affect meaning, clarity, flow, cut it out. In none of these examples is it an absolute rule that you must remove the offending word or phrase. These are simply easily searchable signposts to make you stop and consider if it's the right choice. These are not the only instances where Control+F can be your best editing friend. We have part 1 up already as both a blog post and a video, and a part 3 is on the way in both forms. So flip back and check out this post on showing versus telling, and make sure you stick around for part 3, which is going to look at words that have you hedging or showing a lack of confidence. Let me know if Control+F has helped you tighten your manuscript, and especially if this list or the previous one has helped you identify some issues or unnecessary pieces of prose. If you found a sentence that falls into one of these categories, but you're not quite sure what the right fix is, feel free to drop it down into the comments and I will try to get down there and help you with some suggestions. Or if you'd like someone else to take a look at your full manuscript, you know where to find me. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I had a blast. Catch you next time. Bye. Oh no, I've had these in the whole time. I hate that. Are you singing us the song of your people? You are. Yeah, you're singing us the song of hunger? Yeah. My hairs fell out. I knew it was gonna happen. I can't see through you, buddy. You have to sit if you're gonna be up there. I just hit you right in the schnoz, dude. I can't see my script, buddy.